What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk to you about proper chord voicing. But before we get started with voicing, there's another musical term we need to learn first. That term is polyphony. Polyphony is the name we give to the idea of playing more than one note at a time. Poly coming from the word many, and phony coming from the word phonic, which means sound or voice. For example, you may have heard the term monophonic and polyphonic used to describe a synthesizer. If a synthesizer is monophonic, it can only produce one voice or one note at a time. You can press as many keys as you like on the keyboard, but the synth will only create one note at a time. A polyphonic synthesizer will produce more than one voice at a time. Polyphonic hardware synthesizers are generally limited to the amount of voices they can produce at a given time. However, software synthesizers don't have this limitation. The amount of voices you can create with most of them is only limited by the power of your CPU. Monophonic synthesizers are generally used to play solos and arpeggios, as they're unable to play chords the way a piano or an organ might. Polyphonic synths are generally used to create pads. The term pads can refer to a polyphonic instrument or a group of instruments playing a chord that is sustained and in the back of our mix that gives us harmonic context and glues things together. Think of things like a rhythm guitar, organ, synth, or string section. So then, what is chord voicing? Once you've decided which chord you're going to play, you have to decide how you're going to play it. Let's say we want to play a C major chord, which consists of C, E, and G. On the keyboard, it may be played as a triad, which would be a chord in its most basic form, where you play C, the E directly above it, and the G directly above that. Here's a quick example of a chord progression in C major using only triads. It's okay, and it's technically correct, but it's moving all over the place and it's not very interesting. Now, how can we make this slightly more interesting? Good news, there's more than one C on the keyboard, and that goes for E and G as well. So as long as we're playing these three notes somewhere on the keyboard, we're technically playing a C major chord and giving harmonic context to the listener. For example, we could voice our chord by playing C, the G above that, and then the E above that. Follow this same pattern with the other chords in our progression, and we end up with this. This is a great way to open up your chords and make them sound big. We're still letting our listener know we're playing a C major chord, but we're making it sound much cleaner, and this is important for several reasons. 1. Even though we might have a separate instrument playing the melody, they might take up the same frequency range. We want to hear each instrument clearly, so we've decided to open up our chords and make space if that's what we need to do to make the song sound good. Secondly, it's our job as the producer to make sure we utilize a broad range of the frequency spectrum to make sure that our song sounds full. If our entire song is just drums, bass, and vocals, we're not really doing our song justice, as much of the frequency spectrum is going to go unrepresented. Also, using pads lets our listener know outright what chord is playing, as opposed to making their brain figure it out using just the bass line and the vocals. That being said, don't force these big chords where they're not needed. For example, in EDM, we generally use these big pads during the breakdown. During the breakdown, we usually don't hear a lot of the drums, which take up a huge portion of the frequency spectrum, so we replace it with these big chords. Then, when the drop comes back, we usually take them back out. Now, again, I have to take a moment to say that what I've just given you is a general guideline, and it's not a law that's set in stone. And while I have your attention, like and subscribe. Another thing to keep in mind is that if your bass line is playing your fundamental, then the chords you write for your pads don't necessarily have to start with the fundamental. For example, in the key of C major, our C major chord's fundamental is C. Your bass line is playing it, then you can begin your chords on E or G. Here's an example of a chord progression where the bass is handling the fundamental, so I'm a little more free with how I can then voice my pad. Something else to keep in mind while we're talking about chord voicing would be inversions. We may be writing our song and realize at some point that it sounds better if the bass isn't playing the fundamental and it instead is playing the third or the fifth of the chord. Here, we have a chord progression I've written that includes an inverted G major chord. So instead of the bass playing G, it's actually playing B. So writing our bass line like this allows it to move stepwise. It's not bouncing around from C to G to A to F. It's moving a little more smoothly. This changes the feeling of our progression without changing the actual chord within it. Do some experimenting with this in your next project and see if it helps or hurts your song. You may find that you like it better. So that about wraps things up for today's video. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments, and until next time,